After the GOP debate, a journalist asked Vivek why he was against supporting Ukraine. He said that some post-Zelensky warlord will take power in Ukraine armed with billions of dollars of weapons unless the US quickly stops sending aid. He didn't actually say that. That'd be...
What's that?
Why are you against supporting Ukraine?
Because it does not advance American interests, and as the U.S. president, I'm not running for any other role other than looking after the interests of Americans. However, my plan to end the Ukraine war will actually be probably better for Ukraine. At least it comes out with its sovereignty intact.
How so?
Which is not the plan they're on right now.
Okay, so I just want to throw out a few things here. The first thing is, the national interest point is interesting because when he was challenged on the national interest point on the debate stage by Nikki Haley and others, he didn't really have a response. He said on the debate stage that his plan, and I'm going to dumb it down because he kind of word saladed it a little bit, was give up Ukraine, freeze the line of contact, don't allow them in NATO, give the Russians essentially what they want, and then because we gave the Russians what they want, we can then work with them against the Chinese. Now, there's a million reasons why this is stupid. The first reason, and he bases this off of Nixon's trip to China. For those of you who don't know, during Nixon's term in office, one of his big foreign policy achievements was normalization of trade relations with the Chinese. This was an exploitation of the Sino-Soviet split, which had been developing since the 50s and the 60s, since Stalin's death, when de-Stalinization started to go into effect, which Mao was not a big fan of. That's not the only reason. There were troop buildups on the border and other reasons as to why there was disagreements. But the United States exploited that disagreement. We got listening posts and spy stations on the border. We worked with them to transport weapons to the Mujahideen. And we, started to trade economically with the Chinese and even help them when it comes to certain types of weapons manufacturers and weapons factories and technology and a whole sorts of like science and technology trading. I don't think there is anything that is an equivalent of a Sino-Soviet split happening between China and Russia right now. There's no huge buildup of troops on the border that makes the Chinese feel nervous about Russian incursions. In Russia, the most concern there is around China is selling Russian crude oil to the Chinese at a massive discount, right? That's one thing. They need to have someone to buy their oil and gas prices. I mean, to buy their oil and gas, even if it's at a discounted price, because they've lost their European buyers, which was their main market. It's where all their oil and gas infrastructure is built up in, right? So I don't know what, like the Chinese, like the Russians have a really big interest in continuing to trade with the Chinese. So what are you going to tell him? Are you going to say, not only are we going to freeze the line of contact, but all of our European allies, we're going to tell them to start trading with you again? Instead of them buying American LNG, and this is the thing, by the way, this is what he's saying is for American interests. This is the guy who is saying we need to mine, we need to dig coal, we need to drill gas, we need to do this and that. He wants the Europeans buying Russian crude and Russian energy over American LNG. So, because he would have to make that deal happen as well for the Russians to agree, okay? I don't know if that's necessarily in American national interest, but even that probably wouldn't be enough. You'd probably have to give more of Ukraine if you want more than just the violence and the war to stop it for yourself to look like the peacemaker, even if that's not how Ukrainians would view you. My main point is, and I could ramble about how there's a million different hurdles and why the Russians might not have a big incentive to do this, and how we'd have to make big offers to the Russians that the Europeans necessarily wouldn't want to agree to. My last point on this is, before we continue, if you were to do this, how are you going to get the Europeans, because all of this is done in order to fight the Chinese, how are you going to get the Europeans to agree with them holding 20% of the world's reserve currency in euros, very big economic powerhouse, big trainer with China? How are you going to get them to agree to work with the United States to box in the Chinese if you won't work with the Europeans to defend their security interests? None of these questions were answered on the debate stage. And when he was pressured about, okay, you give Russia what he wants, why does he stop? You just showed him that he has a path to success there. Why would freezing the line of contact now be any different than freezing the line of contact in 2014, 2015 with the Minsk Accords, which didn't succeed in ending the war? The Russians have made commitments before, and those commitments have been broken. He didn't answer any of those questions. He didn't have an answer to any of those questions. When Nikki Haley put forward her idea of why it's in favor of national security interests of the United States, or when the other candidates did so, he didn't really have a response to it. Even though some of their points about it is stuff that I would disagree with, he didn't have a response to any of it. And that's the thing with Vivek Ramaswamy. When I say that he's an upstart, I mean it. This is somebody, this pencil neck geek, this used car salesman is wanting to run the country like a venture capital startup, you know? But you can't just throwing out any million different ideas, just trying to look, put his finger in the air, look for where the political winds are flowing, and just follow that. Just follow that. Just throw out a million different crazy ideas. Who knows if it succeeds? Who knows if it fails? And he has no experience with foreign policy. I disagree with Mike Pence, but when he said that the office of the presidency should not be for amateurs, it should not be for, on-the-job training, he was right. Now, he said that as the former vice president of Donald Trump, so he was the worst person to make that criticism, but he was 100% right. Vivek Ramaswamy knows nothing about foreign policy. And that's why when he said that Ukraine is sending javelins to the cartels to fight their drug war with no evidence, and it was proven false because the photographs that he posted to try to show as evidence were AT-4s. They weren't even javelins. It's a Swedish type of shoulder-mounted munition. He's clueless on this issue. His knowledge is so shallow, and I think it might be informed by a few like John Mearsheimer lectures. And so any pressure I think you apply to him, once somebody really can hold him down in a one-on-one debate on one of these issues, I think if you put Nikki Haley versus Vivek Ramaswamy on the debate stage, I think he would be eaten alive on issues like this. I think he would be eaten alive. And that's not to say that he isn't saying something that's popular with the Republican base. But it's not something that could win over independents. It's not something that could win over Democrats. And I don't think it's something that could even really win over moderate Republicans. If he's not gonna, he needs to have more experience, or he needs somebody around him with more experience. But the ideas fundamentally comes from a misinformed place. So no experts are gonna probably want to work with him on this, unless you're talking about like Caleb Maupin. I don't know. But even Caleb Maupin wouldn't want to do it because of the Chinese stuff. I don't know who would want to work with him on this. Honestly, probably just Mearsheimer. But even Mearsheimer used to say something similar to this. I don't even think he has endorsed this policy anymore because even he doesn't think this works.
In other words, the way this war ends right now, without the U.S. actually stepping in and saying we're not going to fund any more of it, is going to be some post-Zelensky warlord takes over with a couple $100 billion of American military equipment, just like what happened after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and you see how far that got.
I mean, this, again, it just comes from, statements like this come from a complete lack of knowledge about Ukrainian politics. A complete lack of knowledge about Ukrainian politics. Just pumping guns into a country does not necessarily necessitate instability in its governance. If we pumped like $1 trillion in guns to Germany, that doesn't mean the military would necessarily overthrow the government. Now, if there was just an investment in the military and there was investments in nothing else, say it's civil society, which Ukrainian civil society, I would say is pretty active, or investments in, social programs or the basic functions of the state. Like, for example, Niger, or Niger, however you want to pronounce it incorrectly as an American, is an example of this, where we pump like $500 million into security for drones and a military base with 1,000 American personnel. But there's no developmental aid that's actually creating an industry so they can start to process their own resources. Many people in the country still don't have access to electricity. Many people in the country don't have access to safe, affordable housing. Many people in the country, have a ton of economic and social issues, making it one of the most poorest regions in the world, in the Sahel. And so I think when you only pump stuff into the military and you train up the military, it's not surprising that institution kind of takes over the whole state. So the solution to a threat like that would be to try to help the Ukrainians with more humanitarian financial assistance, which we have been doing to a point. But as of right now, we have, I don't know what warlord can even do this. Zaluzhny? Would it be Zaluzhny? Budanyev? GUR? What, we're going to get the 3rd Assault Brigade to march on Kiev? The closest that something like this has ever come to even being slightly suggested was back in 2015 when right sector's leaders started talking about how the government was backstabbing him around the Minsk Accord and everything else. And its leader and most of its membership, when they started to see those statements, really soured on it And it actually caused a ton of controversy. They backed down off of it, and it became nothing. They did like a few protests, and that's it. The government has more central control over the military and has absorbed all of the old volunteer battalions. It is in a least I don't know how to put this outside of the Ukrainian military is more organized and more centralized, and the central government in Kiev has more control over the military and the former volunteer battalions than ever before. So unless he is literally just saying, once we gave money to Afghanistan and then, there was a bunch of fighting afterwards, so therefore that happens in every single country, that ignores the differences between Afghanistan, the differences in ideology when you talk about Islamic extremism, the differences when it comes to geography, and how it is extremely difficult to unite Afghanistan due to its extremely difficult terrain and mountain ranges. And Ukraine has mountain ranges, but not like Afghanistan. We got all these different locations, like very separated from each other between mountain ranges. And it's very I don't want to get into a deep discussion about the geography of Afghanistan. Point is, there's a huge difference between Ukraine and Afghanistan. So you can't, it's not like a one size fits all. Once we gave guns to a country or to a rebellion, by the way. So it was very different with the Mujahideen and the Ukrainian government. One was a democratically elected government that is internationally recognized. The other was a rebellion, right? Another big difference to what he's saying. There's so many differences between these two things that you cannot compare them unless he tries to use, he needs to connect it through something that's similar. But there is no similarity, so he can't do it. He's just spitting stuff out. This is podcaster level of, I read a few Wikipedia pages and I know about other historical events that I know many people at home know about, so I'm just going to connect it even though it has no connection. This would be like, let's say, going into, I don't know, let's say there was a big hurricane in Germany, and I don't know if Germany gets hurricanes, probably not, but there was a big natural disaster in Germany, and we were going to send aid, but then Vivek stands up and said, well, one time we sent aid to this place, one time we sent aid to Haiti, and then corruption happened, so we shouldn't send aid to Germany. This completely ignores any of the difference in dynamic or how the aid would be monitored, or if there would be, somebody set up by Congress to monitor how the aid is distributed and where it goes, how corrupt the German government is in comparison to the Haitian government. There's such a big difference between a centralized, organized democracy in Ukraine and a rebel group that has a ton of political divisions, only united by fight the Soviets. In an extremely difficult to unite country because of its inherent geography. Peter Zeihan could probably talk about that a lot more than I could, or maybe some other, I don't know, some geographic determinist. Anyway, this, every statement he says just bleeds of so much ignorance. I feel like you could honestly get any Just Chatting streamer on this platform, put him in his position, and they would say things as informed as he is saying. They probably just wouldn't say it as slick as he's saying it. Used car salesman. I think he said another thing about Ukraine. I think I had another thing up here I was going to talk about because he said some other things about Ukraine. Yeah, here's another time where he gets pressed on his answers on Ukraine on CNN.
Thank you so much. I have Vivek Ramaswamy here with me. Thank you so much for being here.
It's good to see you, Dana.
And the thing that really got me about that last answer too is he says it with so certainty, with so much certainty. He's saying it as if he he's came to Ukraine and he looked at the situation on the ground. He was criticizing people on the stage for going to Ukraine. And then he proceeds to show how uninformed he is. Well, maybe if he went to Ukraine and he talked to the locals and see how they felt about the war, maybe he would come to different conclusions. Maybe he would have to, inform himself about what's actually happening on the ground. But he said it with so much certainty, like it was almost like a foregone conclusion. Like, oh, if we give them one more gun, Zelensky's going to be shot in the back of the head, and there's going to be some post-Zelensky warlords going to say. He said it with so much certainty, almost like it was a foregone conclusion. Even though there's no expert in his field that I know of, well, not in his field because he's not in the field of foreign policy. There's no expert in the field that would know about these types of things that are saying that this is some imminent threat or really much of a threat to begin with.
Were you expecting the incoming that you got tonight?
You know, it was an honor. I took it as a badge of honor as the 38-year-old outsider in this race who's never been in a political debate to be at center stage and see a lot of his.
You know, maybe I'm just souring on populist rhetoric, but I'm so sick of people just being like, I'm an outsider. I'm different. I'm from the outside of the establishment. And then that's like really all they could say for what experience they have or why they should be, they should be president when they talk about a lack of experience. I'm sick of it. I'm really sick of it. And I'm not saying that somebody who works outside the establishment coming to a position of power is necessarily a bad thing. But if he was to say, I'm from outside the establishment, and here are the things I learned from outside the establishment that would help me govern the country better than the establishment has. He couldn't do that for any of the issues. He couldn't do that for any of the issues. He has no experience outside of, honestly, it sounds like he's trained a debate club and nothing else.
Establishment politicians that threatened by my rise. I am thrilled that it actually gave me an opportunity to introduce myself to the people of this country. We're just getting warmed up, and I'm really thrilled with how it went.
I want to play for our viewers a moment.
Like, a lot of people are surprised, a lot of Trump supporters are surprised at the end of the Trump presidency and why. Well, he never got the wall built, and then the Mexicans never paid for the wall, and it looks like 80 to 90% of his promises didn't happen. And oh my God, why is that? Maybe it's because he's a person with zero political experience with incredibly high turnover. Maybe that's why he couldn't get anything done. So we're talking about somebody, again, you're going to follow up one guy who had zero political experience with incredibly high turnover, who had no clue what he was doing, and all the people around him who could advise him on what to do, he was firing left, right, and center. And now you want to replace him, somebody who wasn't able to achieve the majority of what he wanted to achieve, with another person with an equal lack of political experience, if not more of a lack of political experience, because he didn't even vote until like 2 elections ago for the first time.
That you had with Nikki Haley about foreign policy.
Got it.
You are choosing a murder over a pro-American country.
First of all, Mr. Ramaswamy, you have 30 seconds. Mr. DeSantis,
Nikki, I wish you well in your future career on the boards of Lockheed and Raytheon.
I'm not on
but the fact of the matter, Boeing came off of it, but you've been pushing this lie. You've been pushing this lie all week, Nikki.
You want to go and defund Israel? You want to
okay, let me address that. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to address each of those right now. This is the false lies of a professional politician. There you have it.
Your watch,
so the reality is,
America less safe.
Now, the Israel stuff doesn't really have a big impact on me because you'd have to go into specifics of his proposal, because I think you could write up a proposal, definitely, when you look at the current Israeli government, for, well, if you're not willing to make any like inroads towards peace or any inroads towards compromise where you're obviously in the wrong, right? This isn't a situation where, we're compromising on Israel's like sovereignty by telling them to give up what is their internationally recognized land. That's not what we're talking about. And then I could see a scenario where you're like, oh yeah, we'll drop aid to Israel. If they will not compromise and they refuse to respect the human rights of many people under their occupation, by the way, illegal occupation, well then maybe we will either have to cut aid or even stop aid. And it would depend on the proposal, of course. I don't think it's literally like, hello, I've been elected president, cut off all aid, right? Obviously, you want to sit down, negotiate, see if you can solve the issues. It's the whole point of diplomacy. But he doesn't get an opportunity to talk about this. But the reason why this issue in particular is really bad for him, specifically in this crowd, is because the first primary is in Iowa. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever been to Iowa or know anything about Iowa, but Iowa is a very religious state. Has a lot of very religious people in there, evangelicals. Even when you look at the Democratic primary, I don't know if you guys remember that one person who voted for Pete Buttigieg and wanted to take their vote back because they found out it was gay. Very religious state. Evangelicals have a lot of influence in that state's primary. So coming out against Israel or against aid to Israel might hurt him in what is going to be a very important first primary. And those first primaries can really reshift the balance of any, election. Now, that's, of course, Donald Trump as well was certainly going to dominate. But if there was any path towards victory, coming out against Israel or you get railed on that before the Iowa primaries is something that can most certainly hurt you, especially within the Republican caucus, which has a very, very strong evangelical base in favor of Israel.
You have no foreign policy experience, and it shows.
And you know what? The foreign policy experience.
You don't have foreign policy experience, and it shows.
It does.
Well, the reality is the people who have foreign policy experience, it shows what a disaster it's been from the Iraq war on down to other pointless wars, no-win wars that these administrations from foreign policy establishments in both parties having led us into.
The thing that's interesting about this is that he is trying to use his lack of experience as a benefit, which politically it's been successful for a lot of people. It was successful for Trump. But let's just be for real. Trump's lack of foreign policy experience was not a positive for his administration. While that did mean in some instances he was willing to shake things up a bit, like for example with North Korea, the end of his administration had North Korea blowing up the South Korean liaison office on national TV. He was constantly floundering our relationship with NATO and many of our European allies. He was constantly floundering on the world stage. And the people he picked to be our advisors and diplomats and fill very important positions, like, for example, trying to manage a peace plan for the Middle East, like Jared Kushner, people equally with no experience in the region. And Jared Kushner seemingly is enriching himself based upon the experience and connections he's made, making deals with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia for his businesses. Big money deals in the billions of dollars. So I don't know if not having experience, even if that means you weren't the ones who made the mistakes of the past, a lack of experience could mean you make even worse mistakes in the future. Like, for me, if I was to look at a plumbing job and I wanted to hire a plumber for that job, let's say I hire a plumber with a lot of experience, but he has bad experience. He's been taught at a bad plumbing school. We have him come in, he works the plumbing, it's a big failure. The worst conclusion you should take from this is, wow, I should just hire someone who knows nothing about plumbing because hiring somebody who knew something about plumbing didn't work. No. All that means is you're going to make the situation worse, and you're already in a bad situation with bad plumbing. You're going to bring in somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. You're only going to make it worse. The good solution is to find somebody who knows what they're talking about and put them into that position, not hire somebody with no experience.
I think the results speak for themselves. They've been disastrous. And so I do think that I am the only person bringing clear strategic vision to our foreign policy rather than just going through the talking points memorized in 1990.
Dylan, your points are countered by Zelensky himself. Look at early Zelensky, early in his administration. Look at how the polling numbers were going. It was in a slow descent. It was not looking good. The one thing he could fall back upon was his media training that really helped him, and the fact that he was brave enough to stay in the Capitol. So that helped him. That was very good that those skills were able to help him. But when it comes to many of the issues that he wanted to address, he hasn't been particularly successful thus far. Definitely when he was campaigning against corruption and the lack of experience ended up impeding him, even if he had less connections to the establishment, which gave him a little bit more wiggle room. But to get into his position, he had to make deals with people in the establishment, which then restricted his wiggle room. Which sounds, I mean, I don't want to make Trump comparisons, but if you listen to Trump supporters complain about the first term of Trump, most of them will say he picked the wrong people. He picked the people in the swamp. Hopefully next time he'll pick people outside of the swamp. Yes, you can get lucky, but I think if you're trying to choose somebody for positions of leadership in foreign policy, it's a safe bet to pick people with experience over people with no experience, especially if they're showing, on top of having no experience, that they have no knowledge about the situation, which Vivek Ramaswamy has shown time and time again. He's just saying whatever will get the most clicks and saying whatever the political winds of the Republican base throws in any direction. Whatever, if the winds are going one way, he's going to say that. If the winds are going the other way, he's going to say that. Great example, in his book from 2021, he wrote that January 6th was like a catastrophe. It was a horrible moment for this country, disaster. And that was referenced on a debate stage. And then Vivek Ramaswamy just pretended he didn't say it. because now it's politically inconvenient. The political wins at the time was, oh my God, January 6th is a gigantic disaster. Trump's polling numbers are plummeting. He's going into like the 30. Oh my God, is he going into the 20s? Okay, this is a disaster. Political wins in the Republican base have changed. What do you mean? I never said that. I don't know what you're talking about.
So that might be there have been mistakes made in both administrations on the world stage, but let's just say you're in the Oval Office.
Yes.
And you are, as the President of the United States, part of NATO.
Yes.
And you see what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, just for example, and Russia moves on to a NATO ally.
We will always honor our treaty commitments, but under my watch, Russia will not move on a NATO ally because
How can you be so sure?
Because I will do a deal that ends the Ukraine war on terms that are backstopped by U.S. interests. The deal I would do would be to freeze the current lines of control and make a commitment that NATO will not admit Ukraine to NATO, but we get more in return by requiring Putin to exit his military alliance with Xi Jinping.
Why would he do that? Like I already said this earlier, but again, why? I already addressed most of this in this segment already, but why would he do that? Why would he do that? Why would he exit that military alliance for this? Also, if Ukraine's not going to join NATO, what stops the Russians from just, okay, sure, we'll freeze the line of contact just like we did in 2015. Heals up, revs up their military industry, produces, all the equipment that they lost. And in a few years, they invade again. But now they're invading a Ukraine that has become a rump state. And I don't mean to say that like insultingly, but without Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea, it's going to be more difficult to defend the country. It's like its economy is going to be crippled, losing much of its coastline. And with no NATO guarantee, who's going to come to their defense? Well, Swami, if we listen to his plan, probably not going to be him, probably not going to be the United States. Why? Because he doesn't want to piss off the Russians. Anything that pushes them towards the Chinese can't do. So anytime they step on the Europeans' toes, well, Swami's going to have his hands under his chair. He's going to be sitting on them. He hasn't even said why Putin would do this. He hasn't said why, what break in the Russian-Chinese relationship he's going to exploit to make this happen. And he's not explaining how he's going to make up with the European allies who are going to be, and the Ukrainian allies who are going to be very angry at this 180 in policy and our apparent abandonment of the Ukrainians, especially when, again, you're going to need the Europeans for any plan he has to deal with the Chinese because they're one of the biggest traders with the Chinese.
China is the top threat we face. That's what we actually need to remember. And everybody in that foreign policy establishment, you saw it from Mike Pence today, too. I had to remind him the USSR does not exist anymore.
But you would be president of the United States.
Why does that matter? I don't understand why that matters. Like, if it was the USSR, would it be different? Because we could say communist. See, before it was Russian nationalist bombs tearing apart Ukrainian cities and threatening the sovereignty of European states, starting the largest war in Europe since World War II. But now it's communist bombs killing those children. Now it's different. Like, I mean, ideology matters, but imperialist Russian nationalism is very, very toxic. It's very toxic. It's also extremely bad.
States, not president of Ukraine, and
of course,
President
but
Zelensky.
Ukraine is a client state of the United States because we're paying the bills of their government employees. President
Zelensky wouldn't necessarily agree.
It's just like a simplistic, we give them money, so we own them, so they'll have to do what we say. It didn't work in 2014 when Victoria Nuland wanted them to accept the deal. Why would we assume that the Ukrainians wouldn't just be like, fine, we'll have to go without the Americans, we'll just have to do it with the Europeans, we'll have to go it alone, but it is politically unacceptable for Zelensky to accept this territory is taken, so he just has to keep it going. Why is he so certain that this won't just end with Ukraine having one less ally, Russia having a lot more leverage, and him having solved nothing?
To what you would say about the lines and the boundaries.
So I have two things to say on that. I think when the U.S. stops funding Ukraine, that settles exactly where that goes. But I also think this would be a better deal for Ukraine because it comes out with its sovereignty intact.
If you lose Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea, that's not your sovereignty intact. If I went to Vivek and said, okay, look, we're gonna make this deal with the Chinese, okay, but we got to give up Hawaii, Alaska, California, Washington State, Arizona. You got to give up all these major places. Guam. Your sovereignty will be intact, though. No, that's not your sovereignty intact. That's the exact opposite of your sovereignty being intact. The invasion and annexations are a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. You would be legalizing and enshrining the trampling of Ukrainian sovereignty. You would not be protecting it.
Spring offensive that became the summer offensive, that became the offensive that never was. This is not on track to end well for Ukraine.
Dude, so they're going to look really stupid if in 2 months it ends up being like the Kherson counteroffensive and there's been massive gains. I'm not going to make any predictions because I'm not a military expert, obviously. There is reason to believe that this could not end with the Black Sea being reached. Maybe it'll only be partial success. Maybe the only success we see will be in with some minor territorial gains into degradation of the Russian armed forces. But for every Ukrainian artillery gun that's being lost in Zaporozhye, there are 3 Russian artillery guns being lost. Tremendous damage is being done. We can't pretend it's the counteroffensive that never was. The fighting is ongoing. Whatever.
Ukraine either. And so I think this is good for Ukraine. It will be
it is not good. I would love him to be with a focus group of Ukrainians and ask them if this deal would be good for Ukraine. I would love for him to do it. He would never do it. He would never, ever do it. They say he agrees to like all interviews. Never would do that one.
Certain concessions to Putin, but we win in return. And that's what I'm focused on, America winning.
You are the only candidate who says, and you've said for some time, that you would pardon Donald Trump.
Yes.
The argument that Mike Pence, I believe it was Mike Pence, made was, why are you saying that before he's even convicted and before he even shows remorse?
Well, the reality is we are in the middle of a presidential election, and we have seen indictments. I read each of those indictments cover to cover before issuing my statement on each of them. And the reality is, and you know this, in law enforcement, in every case of a prosecutor, the most damning version of the facts and the law are in the indictment. So if there's something far different that's not in the indictments, that's nearly always true, and anyone in law, the legal practice will tell you it's a fair assumption.
I'm going to be honest, man, considering how little he has knowledge of foreign policy, but he's so assertive in what he's saying. And I think that's a lot of the magic behind him is that he says everything so confidently. Like if I looked in the camera and said confidently enough, like, yeah, the Toyota Sorora can actually hit a max speed of 210 miles per hour. Most people don't know that. Like you have to, like, if I say it confidently enough, you believe it. I just made up a car. That's not even a real car, right? I just threw out a random number, right? But if you say something confidently enough, and if you can move on fast enough, right, you can throw out whatever. A lot of times you can get away with a lot of nonsense. Or by the time they catch you, you're already out of the room, you know? So I have no reason if what he's telling here is true or not. The CNN host seems to disagree, but we're constantly getting more information about these cases. For example, we're finding out from one of Trump's staff members that Donald Trump had them move the documents, the classified documents that he was hiding and mishandling, right? The classified documents that he was showing around to people. We have audio of him saying, this is classified. I could have declassified it while I was in office. I did it. Here are the declassified documents. All of this is on audio. Unbelievably humiliating for him. And it even debunks his own claim of him being like, oh, he declassified it afterwards. Like he's acknowledging he can't do that. But now we're finding out that when he was trying to hide it from the National Archives, when they were requesting it back for about a year, he had his staff move the documents, and then he realized that the security footage would show him hiding the documents, so he had a staff member go and delete the security footage. Does that sound like somebody who doesn't know what they're doing? Does that not sound like a lead we might want to follow up on? An interview we might want to get a little bit more depth in? Like we're going to get testimony during the trial. That's going to be significant. We're going to get people coming forward talking about what Trump did, and that's going to be significant. For him to say before all of the facts have gathered that he would preemptively pardon Trump When we could we could get somebody coming up saying like, yeah, here's more audio of Donald Trump admitting to crime. We already have enough, definitely on the classified documents case, to have a really decent case against the man. But he's saying preemptively pardon him. It's silly. Also, contrast this, which we'll let him finish his point. Contrast this with what he thinks about the Bidens.
To make. So, and I said at the time, assuming that these are the worst statement of the facts from the standpoint of the prosecution, yes, I would pardon Donald Trump on each of those facts, because I think it's a politicized persecution. And this is also part of what I mentioned to Christie on stage, is there's a difference between making a bad judgment and committing a crime. And I think if we start conflating the two, that's a dangerous slippery slope in this country.
Okay, well, that's enough of that. Anyway, here's him talking about the Bidens in comparison. Because, again, don't go after your political opponents. That's terrible. It's terrible. Don't do that.
It's going to take someone of a different
generation. You would pardon Donald Trump. Would you pardon the Bidens?
No. I mean, it depends on, I don't want to be them, right? The real heart of the problem with Joe Biden and Hunter Biden is that I believe they're selling off our foreign policy to make money. Well, and if that's proven in a court of law, they should be in prison probably for the rest of their life.
Yeah, very moderate, very considerate. You know, he holds his position consistently. I even like how Sean is on the other side. He's like, well, you can tell he doesn't even buy it, man. He doesn't even buy it.